Good morning and welcome to our first ever live panel discussion on the ultra-processed food debate. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm really excited to be here as I'm joined by some food industry thought leaders who are going to enlighten us with their perspective on this hot topic. For those of you who haven't seen me before, I'm Martha. I work in the marketing department at Ulrick and Short. My role consists mainly of researching food industry trends, as well as anything from content creation to managing the brand and all of our events as well. Ulrick and Short are experts in clean label functional ingredients. Clean label is really the reason why Ulrick and Short exist. We were set up back in the 2000s to help food manufacturers simplify their label declarations, to improve transparency in products and to help improve consumer confidence. We do this through working consultatively with our customers, and we take a really hands-on approach from concept all the way through to launch. With me today, I'm joined by some food industry experts, so I'm going to let them introduce themselves and give an overview of their position on the UPF debate. So first of all, we have our own ingredients developer, Kate Lefroy.
Hi, I'm Kate Lefroy. As Martha said, I work as an ingredients developer for Ulrick and Short within the product innovation function. And prior to that, I studied a PhD, which was focused on the clean label processing of cellulose and its application in confectionery products. My stance on the UPF debate is I think it's really interesting that consumers are talking more about processing and wanting to understand more about diet and health. However, I think it's still very early days, and in terms of the research and the knowledge that we have around ultra-processed foods, I think we need to approach it with caution.
Thank you, Kate. Next with us today, we have Yvonne Finnegan, who is a registered dietitian and director of Fin Nutrition.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Martha, for inviting me to this webinar. So I'm a registered dietitian and I work as a nutrition and regulatory consultant to the food industry. I've been in the food industry for over 20 years now, but previous to that, I actually worked at the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, and also at the University of Reading. So I spanned, I suppose, academia, also industry and government. And just in terms of transparency, I currently work with companies that produce both foods which are considered to be ultra-processed foods and non-ultra-processed foods. And very much the views I express here are my own. So I just wanted to clarify that. In terms of my stance on UPF, I certainly think that it's an emerging area, but it's far too early to say what's going on here. I think it's certainly too early to be making decisions on policy or regulation based on something that has such a broad definition. However, you know, food manufacturers live in a fast-paced environment and competitive edge is really important. So I do think it's important that we're having webinars like this and discussing the topic to make sure that we stay up to date in this area.
Amazing. Thank you, Yvonne. And finally, we have James Collier, who is the co-founder and Chief Sustainability Nutrition Officer at Huel.
Hey everyone, thanks for the introduction. Great to be here. I'm James Collier, I'm co-founder of Huel, and for people who don't know what Huel is, we make complete foods. We've been around for about 8.5 years. The range includes powders, ready to drinks and savoury range, and it's all about complete nutrition, convenient foods, that are all our foods are plant-based. Now my background, I'm a former NHS dietitian, albeit 20 years ago when I left, and I've also worked in the fitness industry. And as well as Huel, I also try to do some nutrition communication by way of writing articles on Substack and videos on social media. My stance on UPF, I mean, I think we'll probably get you, my stance will be clear as we have this discussion, but it's more about the terminology and the language side of it that I'm going to focus on more, as you'll find out. But I'll probably leave that just there, and you can get a feel for my stance as I talk more.
Amazing. Thank you, James. So thank you to all of our panelists for taking part in our discussion today. Over the next 30 to 45 minutes, we're going to be deep diving into what the UPF debate means for the food industry, what consumer responses are, and how food manufacturers can navigate this. Please feel free to submit any questions that you have in the Q&A box, and we'll get back to you after the discussion. You'll also all be receiving a recording of this panel later on today. So just before we get into the panel discussion, I'm just going to give a brief overview as to what UPFs are and why this topic has come to fruition recently. So food processing is an integral part of our supply chain, and it has actually been around for millennia. Over the last century, we've seen the global population surge, and a huge challenge was around how everyone was going to be fed. This saw the development of mass food production, and we saw new, more productive crop strains. And that has been really crucial in sustaining the population. And now with 8 billion people on the planet, we only need a third of the land to produce the same amount of food as we did in the 1960s. So food processing has played a really pivotal role in our supply chain for several reasons. It's been really significant in food preservation and extending shelf life to not only ensure food safety, but also to meet these growing population demands. Food processing has also facilitated fortification to provide accessibility to essential nutrients. And it's also led to the development of convenient, time-saving products, which are essential for the lives of modern-day consumers. It has led to a lot of complexity in both the manufacturing of and the supply chain of our food system, and that has recently come under the spotlight. Traditionally, we've always focused on the nutrients and the ingredients within food, but the ultra-processed food debate is suggesting a paradigm shift to look at actually what's been done to the product. Currently, there is no legal definition of the term ultra-processed food, but the most well-known classification is the NOVA system, and this splits food and beverages into 4 categories based on its degree of processing. So in category 1, we've got unprocessed or minimally processed foods, and that includes things like fruits, vegetables, meat, fish, nuts, eggs. Category 2 is processed culinary ingredients, so it's things like oils and fats like butter, salt, sugar, honey. And these are often foods derived from group 1 that have been processed by kind of pressing, refining, grinding, milling. Category 3 is processed foods, and these are products from group 1 and group 2 combined, and they've been processed by things like canning, pickling, smoking, fermenting. So it includes products like beer, tinned fish, cured meats, cheeses. And category 4 is ultra-processed foods. So these are products that are made up from a series of processes, including things like extraction or chemical modification. And it includes products such as pizza, crisps, cereals, reformed meats, ice creams. This new suggested lens of viewing food may feel quite unfamiliar to us, but in the Western world, it's actually estimated that over half of our calories come from ultra-processed foods. So we're going to get into the panel now, and we're going to actually start off by discussing NOVA as a framework. So Yvonne, I'm going to come to you first and ask you, is the NOVA classification a useful framework to use?
Okay, well, I'm going to start on a positive note and maybe explain a little bit about epidemiology and what epidemiologists do. And what they do is they actually go out, Martha, and look for associations between different factors. And that often helps give them a lead on whether there are certain factors that help or hinder our health. And so, you know, it is a very useful tool to identify those things, but it does not prove causation. And there are often confounding factors that need to be taken into account. So if I explain this in relation to ultra-processed food, we do see from studies that the more ultra-processed food people eat, the greater their risk of mortality and cardiometabolic diseases. However, that isn't the only factor. People who eat more ultra-processed foods tend to eat more sugar, fat and salt. They tend to have low cooking skills. They tend to be from lower socioeconomic groups. And you can understand then that, you know, you're looking at lots of other confounding factors. If you have a poor income, chances are that, you know, maybe you can't afford to go to the gym. Maybe you live in an area where you don't have access to places to engage in physical activity. So these are all confounding factors that to some extent in some studies have been incorporated, but others that they haven't. And I still think that as nutritionists, we're still asking the question, to what extent are these associations that we're seeing being driven by nutrition, and anything else on top of that, what else could that be? So I think observational studies, and we've seen plenty of them coming out on ultra-processed foods, they're just the start. What good epidemiologists do is then take the next step and say, well, then we need to start looking at mechanisms. We need to start looking at randomized controlled trials to see if this is actually, if ultra-processed foods are actually directly causing these diseases. The problem is that the epidemiologists are using this ultra-processed NOVA category 4. And you see, we're used to maybe having a very defined factor. So looking at, say, added sugars and type 2 diabetes, we're not used to such a broad category like NOVA, where you have not only very different foods to start with. So the meat matrix is completely different to the dairy matrix, which is completely different to plant matrices and cereal matrices. So you have that. Then on top of that, you're lumping in completely different processing techniques, from pasteurization to extrusion and beyond. Then you're lumping in additives, of which there are 300 approved in Europe, and different combinations of those, food contact materials, the list goes on and on. So what's happened is they found this association, hey, that's great, but where do we go from here? And actually where I think we go is we go back to the nutrition science and the scientists who are working on things like, you know, energy density, texture of foods, you know, to see are there links between these factors and ultra-processed food. So I suppose overall, short story, it isn't being helpful. I just want to, if it's okay, if I can just share this slide, which looks at a study that was recently, so this is the sort of studies we often see coming out. Can you see that slide?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a typical slide that we see on ultra-processed foods. It was carried out in the US using data from 3 large prospective cohort studies. And you can see here that overall, the greater the ultra-processed food intake, the greater the risk of type 2 diabetes. But when they looked at subcategories of ultra-processed foods, what they actually found is that over half of them weren't driving an association between type 2 diabetes and those categories, and actually could have been protective. So you can see here, overall, ultra-processed breads and cereals were reducing type 2 diabetes risk, and actually the only risk was from refined breads. Now, this is something that most nutritionists and dietitians would know already. Again, you know, things like yogurt and dairy-based desserts were actually leading to a reduction in type 2 diabetes risk. So it is important, you know, it is such a broad category, but when you start to drill down into it and look at the associations in these subgroups, what we're seeing is things that we've largely known already, that, you know, artificial, sugar sweetened beverages certainly increase type 2 diabetes risk. I would still question whether that association with low calorie sweetened beverages is a true effect, because we know that there is reverse causation there. But I just wanted to show you that, you know, using this category, overall category, as a tool for policy or regulation, it just doesn't hold tight when you start to look at the subgroups. And I think we go back to then looking at the ultra-processed foods that we know already are not good for us and not adding to our diet, things like sugar sweetened beverages and, you know, the sweets, cakes, biscuits, etc. So sorry, I'll come out of that and stop sharing. So I hope that was useful.
Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you, Yvonne, for sharing that. I think, as you mentioned, kind of one criticism of the framework is that it is very broad and it's oversimplifying food categories, not accounting for variation. So James, how practical is the NOVA classification system as it currently stands?
Okay, there's a few things there. The people have attempted to classify degrees of processing for a few decades now. So it's been done, for example, by Ross Hume-Hull in his book, I think about 2000, and that was widely criticised. Then it was done by Georgi Skrinis, who came up with the term nutritionism in his book by the same name, and his famous paper, Sorry Marge, where he's referring to margarine as being the true ultra-processed food, again full of criticism. Nova was I think the term was first used as ultra-processed food in 2009 by Carlos Montenegro of the University of Sao Paulo, and it was formalised in a paper in 2011. Now, it's no coincidence that it came from South America or Latin America as a whole, because that was the region where there was the dietary pattern changed rather quickly. It went from being much more traditional food to having a high degree of so-called ultra-processed food. We'll come to the terminology in a moment, in quite a short space of time. And I know that other South American regions, like Colombia, for instance, are partly basing their food dietary guidelines around with the term taken into account. So I think that's quite interesting. It's important to note why there is a big bias coming from that region of the world. Now, as Yvonne's rightly pointed out with her very useful slides there, there's a correlation. A lot of work's been done by Kevin Hall that's linked as a dietary pattern. People who consume a large amount of foods that fall under this NOVA category 4, there is a disease, there's a link between non-communicable diseases, obesity, heart disease, cancers, Alzheimer's, and several others, certain forms of arthritis, I believe, as well. And that is correlation. Now, Yvonne spoke about mechanistic data. I believe there's some mechanistic data, linking high sugar intake and fat consumption and low fiber all comes into play. But randomized control trials, we're not going to be able to do them. Now, in pharmacy, this is really easy because you get a placebo, you get a drug, and you see how well it works. We know that, there's problems between randomized control trial and nutrition. One is food is a collection of a vast amount of nutrients and phytonutrients and other really interesting stuff that we all like. And we know that having Big Macs several times a day is not going to be probably healthy for us. How very nice it is and how very easy it might to recruit people in the short term to have a diet that's just Big Macs and other people that's just whole foods. We could compare in some randomized control trial, but it would be unethical to do that because we'd be giving people high fat, high sugar diet, which wouldn't be healthy for them. And also compliance, right? In order to look at disease outcomes, we need to be doing this for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. You couldn't run a randomized control trial like that. So we've only got this epidemiological data with maybe a bit of mechanistic suggestion thrown in. Now, that's useful. So NOVA, answer your question, Martha, how do I feel NOVA fits in? It has its uses. I do not want to see people getting rid of NOVA completely. But, and here's the but, it should be confined to academia, in my opinion. Why do I say that? Look, looking at disease patterns is useful. We can look at how meat-rich diets are linked to certain disease outcomes. We can look at how plant-rich diets are disease outcomes. Famously, the Mediterranean diet and all the cool stuff there, and everyone's talking about that, and it seems really good, but looks at disease outcomes. So diets that are rich in so-called ultra-processed foods and looking at disease outcomes can be useful in an epidemiological sense to then feed into other dietary patterns, like the trial that Yvonne's just alluded to that showed it's not all so-called ultra-processed food, NOVA4, that are linked to the diseases. Some actually demonstrated a benefit, and then Yvonne mentioned reverse causation in respect of the sweeteners as well, which is something we could talk more about if we've got time. But humans like convenient explanations for things. We like it. We like to put things in nice little boxes. And the problem we have is over the last year, 18 months, and I'm not going to name names, some high profile academics that are otherwise very credible and done some really, really cool work and done some amazing stuff. They've gone on high profile podcasts and they've started using the term flippantly, urging the public to use it. Now, not only do we have the public using the term, we have other credible dietitians using the term flippantly without giving it any thought, and I think it's confusing the public. Now, at Huel, we put up a social media post yesterday, which is me talking about the term, broadly saying what I'm going to be saying here, and the amount of criticism we had that people was saying that they know what the term means, and then someone else was saying something different. And I think it perfectly illustrated the confusion. So I've got a lot more to say on that, but one thing I want to just get people to think about while we're continuing this debate is we've already got a term. The term was first used, and I've looked this up, in the 1950s, and it was used more formally in the 1970s. The term's called junk food. Now, we all know what that means, but there's certain foods that don't fall under the Nova 4 category that probably are junk food. Like, get chips from your local fish and chip shop, right? It probably isn't an ultra processed food, but we all know that consuming too many of the chips is probably not ideal for us. I don't want to fearmonger and demonize any food. That is not what I'm going to do here, because that's another issue that we shouldn't be doing, that a lot of these social media communicators do wrongly. But we've got certain forms of crisps, potato chips, for any of our Americans listening in, that we've got some that have got 3 or 4 ingredients, would be Nova 3. We've got others that would be Nova 4. Well, I would say, I mean, I don't, saying that ultra processed foods are bad implies that other processed foods are probably okay. I mean, as much as I'd love to consume these non-ultra processed food crisps, several times a day, it's probably not good for my health. So the term junk food would cover that. Now, people who some of these communicators say they like the rigid terminology, although it's, I know part of the debate here is that there isn't a rigid terminology of it. Some of them have tried to give it a rigid terminology and say it's because it has a rigid terminology that make it work. And they accept that there's going to be some foods that fall under this Nova 4 that probably are okay for you, but that's fine. They can be, they're just going to fall into that, and that's just too bad. But I think language is nuanced. Language is all about nuance. This is what philosophers have been telling us for centuries. And the term junk food isn't easily defined. It's just a flippant, casually used term, and that is why it works, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, James. You kind of mentioned there, James, about research, but you kind of mentioned that you think it would be difficult to do certain types of research. If we were to do further research on UPFs, how do you think we could do this?
I don't think we need to do more research on UPF, other than looking at the correlation epidemiology studies that Yvonne spoke about. We can do more of them, and it might be nice, might give us just feed into the more data, but we need to probably do more like, I can't remember the reference, Yvonne, the one you mentioned, but it's more like that, look at the different types of UPF, maybe. What's that, what's the benefit of that? Surely we could be looking at certain nutrients, and I don't want to demonize any nutrients either. We all, I don't want to say sugar's evil, don't have it anymore, everyone, because I don't want to be that person either. But we know we should be cutting down the amount of sugar we have. We know we probably should be cautious of the right sorts of fats, not too much saturated fats, although, maybe there's too much of a wrong focus there. And fiber, we're in a fiber crisis. We know that only roughly 9% of UK adults are meeting the 30 grams a day that we should be having, and arguably that's too low. So, if we are going to look at UPF in research, we should be looking at it in conjunction with other macronutrients.
Yeah, I've probably a slightly different take on that, Martha, if I can come in. And it's, UPF isn't going away, and there's plenty of work, but it's actually the same work that's been turned out, the same observational studies. And I think we need to put a couple of things to bed before we can really move on realistically. And one of them is, going back to the extent to which nutrients are driving this association. We really need to get a handle on that now. And it's not an easy thing to do, but some studies have shown that, once you correct for it, the association does go away. And what that will do is then help us to understand, yes, we're in the right ballpark with nutrition. We need to keep focusing on that, or no, there's other things there that we need to look at. And but we need to move to that sort of next step and get more granular on these mechanisms. And, James was talking about randomized control trials. Well, there's only been one, and you're right, they are difficult to do, but it was quite illuminating because what Kevin Hall's group were able to do was match for macronutrients. So have a highly unprocessed diet and a processed diet, but match for macronutrients, and they still saw effects. But what they were able to do is say, actually, the difference between these two diets was down to energy density. Now, energy density is the kilocalories per gram of food. And if you have a very energy dense diet, it's very easy to quickly eat that and overconsume calories versus an energy, not an energy dense diet. But actually, we as nutritionists have known about this for years. I mean, I think it was 20 years ago I picked up the papers by Barbara Rolls on this area. So I think, you know, randomized control trials are a way of doing this. Yes, they won't give you the longevity. You can't do it ethically for long periods of time, but they may be able to help us find additional mechanisms. So in addition to, you know, nutrients, it might be energy density. It might be things like texture. So processing might affect the texture of some foods, not all, but to the extent that that texture might be driving greater eating rate. And in fact, there is another study that shows that regardless of whether food is processed or unprocessed, hard texture is the thing that reduces eating rate. And it makes plausible sense. And you can actually see this in trials, that if you make the texture very soft, people eat more and of it. So these are all things I think are worth teasing out. Some of them we already know about, but we may need to just look at them through the lens of UPF and see, is this what's driving the UPF? Out of that, I also think, you know, there are other plausible areas that we could be looking at, say food contact materials. If you're eating more ultra-processed food, chances are that your food is in contact with food packaging for longer. Could there be some issues around food contact materials that we need to look at? So I think on one hand, we ignore epidemiology at our peril, but we do need to start understanding, you know, what it is specifically about the association, and it could be food contact materials. So these are all further areas of research I think are important.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Thank you, Yvonne. I think you both mentioned about how we've kind of always looked at food in terms of its nutrition. In the UK, we have HFSS regulations. Across Europe, we've got Nutri-Score, but UPF is suggesting a new way to look at food. So Kate, should we be looking at food in terms of its processing?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, yes, we have to, you know, especially in light of the UPF debate and you know, more kind of mistrust that's been generated around the food industry and processing and consumers, which I think is really a shame. I think, you know, almost all of the food that we consume is processed in some way, whether that's when we buy it or when we process it ourselves at home in our kitchens. And unfortunately, processing is a term that, you know, amongst all these discussions has been painted in a very negative light, where actually processing is absolutely fundamental to you know, the supply and the security of food. And if we go way back, you know, it was first used to kind of improve shelf life and stop pathogenic growth and things in food, so that people could consume a more diverse range of edible foods. And then that, you know, in more recent years, that's led to the development of really significant inventions like pasteurization, sterilization and canning, which really allow preservation of nutrients over a longer period of time. And again, improve shelf life, improve transport life, improve distribution of food and accessibility of food to a range of geographies and people. And then also more recently, processing has really helped to allow people following, you know, specific dietary requirements or having to avoid allergens. You know, they can still access and consume a real range of nutrients and a real range of products. So I think we really need to kind of refocus the discussion around processing and not underestimate its usefulness and its importance in improving food safety. And rather than categorizing it as something that's, you know, quite dangerous or quite negative, it's actually, you know, it's fundamental to ensuring that we don't poison ourselves. In the same way, I think it's really interesting to look more at new processing methods. So within the clean label debate, we look a lot at minimal processing of food. So really looking to you know, preserve the natural functionality and the natural nutritional quality of food, but process it in a way that improves its functionality, improves its palatability, improves its digestibility. And I think that's really important to make that distinction between, you know, processing that might be really destroying a food and taking it away from what it was in its natural form, and processing which is really serving to actually make the food more functional and, you know, ultimately deliver, you know, meet consumer demands to deliver food which is more fresh and quality and safe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Kate. I think, James, you kind of alluded to the nutrition crisis that we're in. Do you feel like the UPF conversation is taking away the focus on nutrition?
It was more the fibre crisis in particular that concerns me, and I think it's one of the biggest issues we're confronted with, because, you know, there's the carnivore trend and the paleo trend that seem to be coming up again on social media, especially amongst males, because it's macho, and fiber's not that macho. So, you know, people aren't getting enough. And the carnivore diet concerns me because, you know, I don't want to demonize any dietary regime, etc. But the lack of fiber that comes with it and the high saturated fat content, I mean, it's concerning. We're not going to get the data for a long while, because, and then it's going to be epidemiological data. So, but ultra processed foods, it's the implicit negativity that comes with the term that concerns me. And now, the more astute listeners at the moment, we're saying, hey, James, of course you're going to be saying that. You run Huel, and doesn't Huel come under Nova 4? Well, I didn't make the classification, so I don't know where it goes, but people probably would say that. So, but, you know, let me use another example. Let's look at breakfast cereals. Now, one of those that are big advocates of the terminology of ultra processed food, also, they would probably say that if it contains a long list of ingredients and some of those ingredients can't be found in a run-of-the-mill kitchen or run-of-the-mill shop, then it's ultra-processed food. Another thing they say is, if the food is making a health or nutrition claim on the packet, it's probably an ultra-processed food. That's a load of rubbish to me. So let's take one breakfast cereal. Let's look at shredded wheat. Now, even the biggest fan of the terminology would not say that's a Nova 4. It's 100% whole wheat, written all over it as a nutrition claim. And it makes a bunch of other nutrition claims on it as well. Okay, shouldn't we be encouraging people to have shredded wheat rather than some of the high sugar alternatives? I think we should. What about Weetabix? Okay, Weetabix arguably comes under Nova 4. Now, it's been pointed out to me that on some of these ultra processed food apps, it comes under Nova 3, but it contains added vitamins that you can't, you know, keep in your pantry. It contains malted barley extract, which I don't think many people have that, and a couple of other things. So I would say it's under Nova 4, but the very fact that some people think it's under Nova 3 and others think it's under Nova 4, isn't that the problem? Isn't that the confusion itself? And I think Weetabix are a nutritious, high fiber food. We need to be encouraging people to have more fiber in the diet. So this is where some ultra processed foods that are high in fiber would be beneficial. And guess what? It's high in fiber, everyone. But, you know, so, you know, and so maybe I've got a bias there, but we've got a fiber crisis. We want people to having a good amount of protein as well, due to the caloric availability being lower, and it helps people keep people feeling full for longer, and it targets some of the hormones that send signals telling us we don't want to eat so much. Yvonne's mentioned the hardness and the density of the food, the actual physical density of it. So what we're fighting against is we need more fiber, possibly need more protein. It depends. That's up for debate. We need to get people to have more micronutrients. Well, certain ultra processed foods can manage that. But we've got a problem with energy toxicity, i.e. too many calories. And like Yvonne's pointed out, we know that it might be the hyperpalatability of these bad, for want of a better term, ultra processed foods that are causing people to want to eat more, because let's be honest, a lot of them taste really nice, and I can certainly go through a tube of Pringles pretty rapidly. So it's the energy toxicity and also the cheapness of a lot of these foods, the manufacturing process, that encourages people to have more, especially when they haven't got the skills to cook, you know, and because maybe there's a cost of living crisis, right? And some of these foods are more affordable. And this brings me to two other points. A lot of the demonization of anything that falls under ultra processed food by some of these online communicators is very frustrating, because some people, that's what they can afford, and that's all the skills they have. And they've got challenges, many challenges in their lifestyle. And it's a very privileged position to be able to criticize what other people eat. Just make people feel a little bit worse about the situation they're in. Why don't you? And I find that quite frustrating. So that's, and that's the same with demonizing any particular food. The other thing, of course, and we haven't mentioned this yet, and it's key to our values here at Huel, is the environment, sustainability. We've got an environmental crisis. Martha, in your slide at the beginning, we've got, I think, 8.1 billion people to feed. Okay, this appeal to nature bias that everyone has. Let's go back to how we were in our agrarian or hunter-gatherer, lifestyle. Well, that would be lovely, but we're not going to get into utopia here. It's not going to happen. What we can do is a form of protopia, which is a term that I think is quite useful. We can get to look at another sort of world where people are making better food choices. And this will incorporate things like GMOs. I know that's a can of worms there, and some people are pro them, some people aren't. Different agricultural methods, regenerative agriculture. We're going to need some plant-based alternatives like plant-based milks, like plant-based meats, the cellular agricultural space. And will that be ultra-processed food? For people that don't know, these are the lab-grown meats and dairy and egg proteins that are made by genetically modifying some bacteria and then feeding them a certain way, so with cells, so you get the exact equivalent of meat, just not from an animal. Would that be ultra-processed? I don't know, probably not, but where's that going to fit in? I think that's important because that's coming. Some companies are already commercial. We need that. We need other high fiber foods as well, and nutrient-rich foods to combat the stresses on the environment. We've got increasing greenhouse gas emissions, where more than a quarter of which come from the food system. So it's a multifaceted response, and just demonizing everything, or even those that don't actually demonize ultra-processed foods, it's still the implicit negativity in their communication that comes with it that we need to be moving away from. And that's why I prefer the term junk food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that really nicely takes us on to talking about kind of pressures and demands. Often in the food industry, when new products are developed or launched, it's due to either kind of pressures from below, so consumer pressures and market trends, or pressures from above, such as regulatory changes. And a good example of that is the sugar tax. So Yvonne, with your kind of background in regulatory changes, we have seen in some South American countries where the NOVA system was developed, has been used to influence dietary guidelines and regulations. Do you think regulation is a realistic possibility in Europe?
I don't really. As somebody who works in regulatory on a day-to-day basis, I just can't see how this would work. I mean, we need to be clear. Food regulation in Europe is absolutely based on science. It's based on fact, and it's based on evidence and reports. Without that, we couldn't put together proper regulation. I mean, if we were to regulate based on UPF in the morning, what would happen is our courts would fill up with food manufacturers fighting against the government as to whether their product was a processed food or an ultra-processed food. We know from a study done in France that they asked 300 nutrition professionals to categorize foods as processed and unprocessed, and I think they asked them to categorize something like 270 foods. There was only agreement on 4 foods. So if nutrition experts can't even agree on what's a processed or ultra-processed foods, I can assure you that that we're just going to waste court time on useless arguments. So I don't see it happening in the morning. But the point I do want to make is there's this notion that, there is no regulation on ultra-processed foods, and that's absolutely incorrect. We have had restrictions and regulations on subcategories of ultra-processed foods for many years. I mean, the sugar tax is an example. It's on sugar-sweetened beverages, which is a subset of ultra-processed food. We've had restrictions on high-fat, sugar and salt foods in the UK and Ireland and other parts of Europe for many years. Advertising is restricted to audiences which have more than 25% of children. And we saw recently, in the last couple of years, we've had this regulation on food promotion and placement, which pertains to large retailers, where they cannot promote HFSS products at the end of their aisles or in prominent places in the supermarkets. And, those retailers have gone to huge expense to reconfigure their aisles, to meet these regulations. And we know, I think it's October 2025, there will be further restrictions on buy one, get one free on HFSS. So I think, we shouldn't say, oh, there's no regulation on ultra-processed foods. It's not on ultra-processed foods per se, but it's on a subcategory called high-fat, sugar and salt products that we know there's plausible mechanisms around why we shouldn't have these in the diet. And the reason we have that is because there is a nutrient profiling model that's objective, and any nutritionist can sit down, plug in the values and come up with the same values as the next nutritionist. So it's something that can stand up in a way in court and be used. So I just wanted to, say that there are regulations or restrictions on ultra-processed foods. I think European governments tend to listen to the likes of EFSA and SACN, the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition in the UK. And these, SACN certainly has been clear that ultra-processed foods, there is not enough evidence there to be changing dietary recommendations or to be changing regulation and policy. So I don't think we're going to see it in the morning, but, we can't be complacent about this. And as we say, these webinars are really useful because the food industry needs to stay on top of this issue because it's changing so rapidly.
Yeah, amazing. No, that's some really good insights there on that. And James, are you seeing any changes in consumer behaviour relating to UPFs? And if so, what kind of things are you seeing?
I've not analysed the data on that, so I don't know whether there is. I do probably spend too much time on social media because I'm trying to do it myself. So I look at other people's and get really wound up at some of this miscommunication, which is probably not good for my own health. But I see a lot of negativity about, and the term used, and I see the term used both by people that give some very questionable content, using it flippantly. Oh, it's got a long list of ingredients there, it must be bad for you. Why are you eating this? But I also see the term used by some very credible content makers who are giving some really, really good advice, but they're just then they also suggest cut down on ultra processed food without defining that. And I find that probably more frustrating because these people, we need these good communicators because there's so many of the bad ones out there. And I realize what I'm doing there, I'm creating a divide with good and bad. I don't mean to, but I'm just using it for illustrative purposes here. We need to just, I, in my communication, only use the term ultra processed food when I'm talking about the term ultra processed food. I use the term junk food because I feel it's better. And I've been criticized for that. And it's the non-understanding of the term. And I think people also just look at one thing. They're looking at people at their own health or advising other people on the individual health. And we have so many issues with the food system, and this includes animal ethics and cost, and of course the environment, which I've spoken about. And you can't separate the individual from the environment. We are part of the environment. We are human. We are animals. And so, and with the environmental pressures, where we are in the third decade of the third millennium, the term nutrition has to be linked to sustainability. There's a reason why my job title is Chief Sustainable Nutrition Officer, because I've got, my background, my academic background isn't in sustainability. I've just learned this on the fly. My background is nutrition, but you have to link the two. And so any communication has to factor in thinking about that as well. That's hard. So as far as, could there be regulation about ultra processed food? It'd be really hard, like Yvonne said. If the only way some sort of regulatory could work with it is factoring it in as part of something bigger. That would include HFSS as well, which makes it hard. The degree of processing and high fat, sugar or salt. It would have to include its fiber content as well. To me, that's a big deal. That would be really hard. It should factor in any sustainability credentials. We can measure CO2e relatively easy now on food and get some objective markers there. What about food culture? Nobody's mentioned that. Culture is important to people. It's part of their background, their cultural identity. We live in a culture of of ultra processed food. Maybe that's what people are trying to push. We'd have to factor then, how could we possibly have some sort of regulation, some sort of advisory that factors in all those things together? It would be impossible to make something user friendly, let alone understandable. And like Yvonne pointed out, if nutritionists can't even categorize what ultra processed foods and processed foods are, we've got no hope of pushing that. So what maybe the way is about better education. It's about educating people to know how to prepare food properly, how to make better shopping choices, what to look out for. It's hard. And I think it's being made harder by poor nutrition communication by people that should know better.
Yeah, thank you for that, James. So just before we kind of end the discussion, I just want to talk about kind of the role of the food industry and potentially some practical steps that they could take. So Kate, does the food industry have a role to play here relating to the UPF debate?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's been some really good points made already on the webinar, and James, just as you were saying there, I think education is key and communication is key. You know, there's been a lot of mistrust of the food industry generated by the UPF debate, also, you know, in previous topics, but particularly you know, conversations around the fact that processing is employed to almost trick consumers into overeating or overindulging, when actually, as we've already discussed, a lot of processing is actually employed to ensure safety of food. So I think there's definitely a lot of education in that sense, but also I think it's so confusing for consumers because this topic has been discussed in the wider media. There's lots of people giving opinions that aren't necessarily the most informed people to be doing so, again, as James has touched on. And as a consumer, you know, as a consumer myself, I think it's very tempting to take a very simplistic view of it and say, okay, great, I've seen a definition for UPF that says if I can identify UPFs by a long list of ingredients, when actually, on the other hand, nutritionists are advising us to eat a wide variety of plant-based materials. So it's so confusing to navigate, and actually conveying something that is so complicated and has so many nuances and has so many, you know, things that we still need to understand as a very simplistic model is not effective and is not helpful at all to consumers. So in terms of what food manufacturers can do, I think certainly education pieces around nutrition and health and communicating what we do know clearly. But also, yeah, looking at processing methods and really understanding, and ingredient labels, and understanding why those ingredients are put into those products, why those processing methods are used. Could we make them more sustainable? Could we look at more clean formulations and using more minimal processing methods? And that, yeah, again, ties in with the nutrition and sustainability debate. You know, going forward, it's better for the future of the planet as well.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. So I'm just going to get some closing thoughts from both Yvonne and James. So Yvonne, are there any practical steps for those watching today that you could suggest potentially that they could take in relation to the debate?
I take your point, Kate, about education is absolutely important. I don't think the food industry is necessarily the people to be communicating, but I certainly am delighted to see nutritionists and dietitians from the BDA and British Nutrition Foundation stepping forward and saying, look, we don't know enough. People shouldn't be turning away from shop-bought wholemeal bread. It's a really good food. You know, don't be so black and white about this sort of thing. So I think nutritionists still, you know, we really need to be there to the fore, putting out the facts that we know and the dietary, sticking to dietary recommendations. So I think that's a piece that's done outside probably the food industry. Label transparency is an interesting one. And look, there are regulations around what you need to put on labels. So, you know, manufacturers are bound by that. They need to show what the additive is and why it's there. But I did see a very interesting example on my shop-bought wholemeal bread, and it had so it had preservative, calcium propionate, and in brackets it said added to bread during hot months or whatever to prevent mold growth. And as soon as I read that, I went, that is fantastic. Now, I don't know if you can actually do that legally, but I thought that is a really simple explanation. And as somebody who, to your point, Kate and James, it's not just about nutrition, it's about sustainability, it's about reducing food waste, as you know, it's about the environment. We need to be thinking about the trade-offs here, and that to me is a very good explanation why that preservative is in there, and for me as a consumer why it's useful, because I don't have room in my fridge to be putting the bread in. So I think there could be moves, and I think but we may need to get regulation to unlock whether, you know, we can talk to consumers about why certain preservatives are being used in our products. You know, I suppose with my industry hat on, I have to say, you know, we ignore the UPF debate at our peril. You know, to Kate's point, if you can find processes or ways to make your label cleaner, then absolutely be it, but be very careful. We do not want the UPF debate to disincentivize the food industry from reformulation, and we don't want to disincentivize them from fortifying foods, because, you know, say for example, breakfast cereals make up a decent proportion of our vitamin and mineral intake in the day. So sorry, they're my, you know, so please don't be put off the UPF debate and say, well, I'm only going to have 3 ingredients. That is not the way we should be interpreting what's going on at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Amazing, thank you, Yvonne. And James, kind of the same question to you. Are there any practical steps that the industry could take at this moment, or should they be taking any practical steps?
Yeah, there's 3 points I want to make, really, for 3 maybe closing points. So what Kate said really about the industry being educators, I actually think there is a role for the industry to be educators. I think it benefits the business. I can only speak from my own experience here, but we do a lot to try and educate broadly, and we don't even mention Huel in a lot of our education. It helps the business. It helps us seem more credible and helps people trust us more, and I think that's a good thing. So there is an incentive there for business to communicate, but some of that would have to come top down from the government. The government should be leading initiatives, and just getting restaurants to stick calories on their menus, that doesn't really count, does it? There's so much wrong with that. I don't want to go down that can of worms. Then, you know, look, we spoke about the palatability of food and so-called ultra-processed food. Companies make food taste nice because, well, people want their food to taste nice. Is that so bad? Sure, you know, we can argue about the hyperpalatability side of it, but if more healthy food that happens to be ultra-processed is made to taste nice, it's probably a good thing. And the third point I want to say is, which leads on from that, is, look, ultra processing can be a really useful tool to get us out of the multiple crises with which we're faced: the poor nutrition crises, the environmental crises that we could talk about, the ethical crisis as well, animal treatment and human rights, etc. Maybe we can use ultra processing as a tool to get ourselves out of this, along with other technologies.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you, James. So I'm going to bring the panel to a close there. But I think that was a really, really interesting discussion, and there was definitely some really interesting points made there. So thank you to our panelists for joining us today. I think what's really clear is that processed foods, or processing of foods, are really important to the lives of modern day consumers for lots of different reasons. I think it's also clear that the research on processing of food is still quite new. There's a lot more kind of education to do as well. But yeah, I'd like to say just a massive thank you to the panelists for joining us today and for enlightening us with their perspectives and their expertise. And a big thank you to all of you for attending and engaging with us today. If you do have any further questions or thoughts on the topic, then please feel free to get in touch with us. There will be some contact details on the next screen. If you'd like to get in contact with James or Yvonne, then feel free to reach out to them on LinkedIn. We will just leave this open for a couple of minutes for any last questions that might come through, and we will be circulating a recording of this discussion later on today, so you can watch it back or send it to a colleague who you think might be interested in it. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you at our next live event.